I volunteered for the Army Medical Corps during the Korean War as a physician. If you didn't volunteer, you would be drafted as a private in the infantry. And I think all but one physician in the Korean War was someone who was drafted. All the rest were volunteers.
Oh, wow. You said you got a BA? BA from what school?
From Columbia University.
And your master's, you said, was in Yale?
No, my MD was from Harvard Medical School.
And then you went to Yale?
And then I went to Yale for my surgical training.
How old were you?
Let's see, that was 1945. I was 26. 26?
26. What year do you think that was?
I'm 52.
52.
I was born in 26.
Around what time did you think you got into the Army?
I'm sorry, what?
What year did you join the Army? Did you enlist?
Well, I knew I was be drafted as a private if I didn't enlist.
Mm-hmm.
So I volunteered.
Was this at the beginning of the war?
Well, the war started in 50, and I was
Still in school.
suggested that I volunteer in 52. And I served from 52 to 54.
When you enlisted, where did they send you?
Well, I first went down to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, in San Antonio. We were given some very basic training, mainly how to put on your uniform, which I never remembered, and a little bit of instruction in the use of a pistol. We were frightened by having to crawl under barbed wire with machine guns firing overhead, but the machine guns were fixed in concrete, and I kept wishing that I was fixed in concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I was shipped to Japan and then Korea.
Okay. Now boot camp, what was that like? You obviously...
Oh, well, that boot camp for the doctors was pretty lax. I mean, you were supposed to march in unison. If you looked out at the training field, you could always tell the doctor units because nobody was in step.
Your whole unit was all medical
Yeah.
personnel? Wow. Were you the oldest?
Oh, I was probably the youngest.
Really? At 26?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Remember, all these people had been to college and medical school, and I happened to have gotten into college because of the war at a young age. I went with no vacations for 2 years and got the degree.
Smart. Now, when you went to Japan, do you remember where you were in Japan?
You know, we went to, no, I don't remember the name, to Yokohama, and we only stayed there a few days, and then we took a boat to Incheon in Korea.
This is still 1952?
In 1952.
Oh wow, did you fly or was it a ship that brought you?
We flew from San Francisco to Japan, stopping at that time in Hawaii and Wake along the way. It was an old DC-6. You could look through the crack in the floor and see the Pacific underneath.
What did you think of the Pacific?
It was big.
It was new, right? Have you ever seen the Pacific Ocean before that time?
No, I'd never been west before.
What did you think when you got to Japan?
Well, I felt as though I was in an Alan Ladd movie. I expected to see. I was in an Alan Ladd, was an actor who played back in the 40s and 50s, and Japan looked very threatening. However, 8 months later, when I had a 5-day R&R in Japan, it suddenly was a very safe, home-like place. And it hadn't changed, but I had.
Oh, wow. What do you mean you had?
Well, I began to realize that it wasn't threatening, it was just different.
Okay. Did you notice, how should I say this, any post-war damage from World War II still in Japan?
Well, no, not damage. The Japanese were very grateful for the way MacArthur had treated them. some of the people that I got to know later said if the Japanese had won the war, they wouldn't have been as nice as MacArthur was.
Oh, even after we dropped the bomb, we still say that.
Well, by 1952, 53, when I lived in Japan for a year, in 1953, the bomb damage was confined to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
No effects of radiation?
No, not at that point, no.
Yeah. Did the Army give you any medical training? I
No.
mean, you were educated as a doctor beforehand, but like their medical procedure for how you should dress and take care of it?
No, actually, wartime surgery, you have to be prepared for almost anything because a bullet doesn't know anatomy. And when we would have to operate on a young, healthy soldier with chest, abdominal, orthopedic, vascular, urologic, you didn't know what we were going to find when you opened the wounds and looked inside his chest and his abdomen. And so you had to be prepared to repair according to some basic principles of surgery. And you had to be aware of the anatomy and you had to be able to improvise. So with a good grounding in surgical principles, you could meet the demands of the situation as you found it.
Okay. How did you feel about that kind of medical procedures?
Well, I was ambivalent because professionally for me, it was very valuable. I did hundreds, even 1,000 cases, and I gained the knowledge and the ability to handle almost anything I was faced with, at least to get the patient off the table alive and giving that patient the possibility of return to normal life. On the other hand, seeing an 18 to 21-year-old young man who come in with loss of an arm and both legs, that was very discouraging. What do you tell that young man? How do you tell him you're going to not have legs? You may have to have an artificial leg. What does that mean to him? What does he look forward to? And it made me realize the futility of war. And I used to say that war should be fought by old men like me, not by young men.
Very true. When you were being trained for medical school, did you ever have that kind of situation where it was quick, you had to decide fast, here's the problem, fix it?
Well, no. When you're in training, there's always someone senior to you to call to help solve a problem. And one is just learning, so you don't... It might have happened once or twice when someone wasn't available and something happened, but very rarely. But even in the Army at the MASH, we had 4 or 5 operating tables in one room. So if you ran into a problem and you needed consultation, you'd call over to the next table and say, "Hey, Charlie, take a look at this." And they'd walk over with their gloves, sterile gloves, look over your shoulder and say, "Oh yeah, this is what I did when I saw that last week." Or, "I don't know, you'll just have to wing it."
Did you find that was happening a lot? You had to just decide on your own?
Well, in the beginning, I would call people and ask for corroboration of what I might have decided. As I gained more experience, I became the more senior person, so that by the end, I was the most senior person as I moved to some other MASH hospitals.
Now, you said you arrived in Incheon, Korea first.
In where?
How do you pronounce that? Incheon?
In Incheon. I-N-C-H-O-N. It's the port
That's where you arrived first?
Yeah,
Around what year? 1952 still?
1952.
All right. What happened there?
Well, then we got on a train and we traveled up
How long did you stay in Incheon?
one day.
One day?
Yeah, and then we were on the train. I already had orders posting me to a medical facility just above the 38th parallel and a little bit northwest of Seoul.
Okay.
So we were only 10 or 15 miles behind the front lines.
Okay. Do you know exactly where you were? You can't. The name of your base?
No, it was the 8055 MASH.
Okay. And you arrived there with everyone you went to boot camp with?
No. We were split up. There were people from other places.
So all the surgeons were trained and then they dispersed them all?
Well, they all went to a boot camp for doctors, and then most of us were shipped over. I almost got out of going to Korea. My wife had worked in the general's office while we were going through training, and when we had found I was going to be shipped over, she told the general that was going to be leaving. He said, well, if I could arrange for your husband to stay here, would you continue to work? She said, sure. But it happened my orders had been cut already, so it never came to pass.
Oh, that's too bad. Would you have accepted that? You would have rather stayed in America?
Oh, sure. I'm a devout coward. They're using real bullets in Korea.
Sorry for that. Now, you were stationed above the 38th parallel near Seoul. Is that the only place you stayed?
No. If you follow the 38th parallel east-west, I was closer to Seoul at the first MASH where I served for several months, and then I was transferred to another MASH that was east of that one, and then another one that was east of that one, and another one finally that was only 10 miles from the coast.
Okay.
And I found out later that a friend of mine had very nicely volunteered me to be in that last MASH because we were supposed to join with a sea assault to go around behind the Chinese lines and attack them from behind. But fortunately, we found out that the Chinese knew about this, and so they canceled the excursion.
Wow. How long did you stay at each MASH before you left the next one?
Well, I was there almost a year. I would say I was at the first one for about 3 months, and then three-month intervals or so.
Was it as the front line moved?
Well, I moved from west to east, but the front line moved north and south. We'd take a hill, they would knock us off the hill. We would knock them back the hill, knock them off again. The lines were fluctuating, and once or twice we were overrun by the Chinese.
What would happen when you were overrun?
We put the patient on the floor, took the stretcher and the patient off the operating table, sat down on the floor, waited till the shooting stopped, and then someone would say, it's okay, everybody's gone. So we'd bring the patient back up on the table and finish the operation.
How'd you feel about that?
Scared.
Yeah, how many times do you think that happened?
Twice.
Twice? Now your MASH. What is a MASH?
MASH is Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. It started in World War II when the head physician for the Army realized that they would save lives if they could get the wounded to a hospital as soon as possible after the injury took place. So they set up these mobile hospitals in World War II, and they evolved to a a hospital that would be mobile, so that if the front line moved away for 10 or 15, 20 miles, the hospital would pack up and move closer, and reverse if necessary. So the main issue was the mobility of the hospital. They could pack the hospital up, leave the operating room standing while we finished up, and be ready to move in a number of hours. Today, they have hospitals that can be blown up. They're pneumatically inflated, and within an hour you could have a functioning operating room.
They're all compact?
All compact in a couple of trucks, and you're ready to go.
Did you ever pack it
No,
up?
no. Well, we had to move a number of times, but we didn't have these new hospitals. We had canvas tents and the standard Army tent. If we were going to be in a place for any length of time, they would build a little more Quonset type structure.
It was more stronger?
A little stronger, a little more insulated. Remember, we went through the Korean winter.
What was that like?
Which was cold. In fact, in the first years of the war, the soldiers were incompletely provisioned with warm clothes, and there was a lot of frozen feet. But then, after the first year, they did pretty well keeping people warm. In our tents, we just had a kerosene stove.
That's what kept everyone warm?
They kept it so that you could sit with a jacket.
Explain the environment of the MASH. What was going on in the MASH?
Well, most of the MASHers had a helicopter unit attached to them, or one that would serve 2 MASHers. And there was a receiving room. You could hear the helicopters coming miles away because you were in the mountains and the sound was reflected. So you could hear the putt-putt of the helicopter, and you knew you were going to have to work. And you'd get anywhere from 3 to 50 casualties. And sometimes we'd work for 2 days straight. Most of the time we worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So the patient would be brought in by helicopter during the day. At night they would be brought by ambulance, but that took much longer because the ambulances at night couldn't travel more than 15, 18 miles an hour. And the roads were not very good.
Because of the terrain, right? The hills.
And so there's a receiving tent where one of the doctors and the nurse would evaluate the patients and say, this one needs immediate care, this one is next, and this one can wait a couple of hours or a couple of days if necessary. We didn't really complete all the surgery. You can't close a traumatic wound from gunshot or mortar right away. There's too much dirt, clothing, so you clean it out to good tissue and then leave it open, and when the patient is transferred to another hospital, 4 to 5 days later, you can close the wound and it will heal without infection most of the time. Then from that receiving tent, they went to a preoperative tent where they were prepared. In the receiving tent, their clothes were cut off and they were examined as to what the injuries were. And you always had to raise the patient up to see if there were any wounds on the back, because bullets go through the body at times. Then they went to a preoperative section, and then there was an operating room, and then a recovery tent. And the recovery tent, we kept patients anywhere from 6 hours to 2 or 3 days. Most of the time, we had to get them out by 2 or 3 days to make room for the new ones coming in.
That sounds like you were busy. Was it always packed?
Yes, we were busy all the time.
Now, in a MASH, was there a certain MASH for a certain radius of miles and everyone came to that MASH? Or were you just designated to a certain division?
No. Each MASH supported an army unit, a battalion or a regiment or whatever. And now there were only 2 MASHs with neurosurgeons. And so if someone came with a head injury, if we could handle it, if it was relatively simple, we would take care of it. But if it was more severe, we would put the patient back in the helicopter, or we would know beforehand, and transfer that patient to the MASH that had the neurosurgeon.
Did your MASH have a neurosurgeon?
No.
How far away was the closest one?
I would say 15 to 20 miles.
Okay. Did that happen a lot, where you had to send people out?
A lot? I don't know what's a lot. We saw
Was it common?
hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients. There weren't that many compared to the body wounds.
Yeah. What kind of things did you use in the MASH? What was your tools?
Well, standard surgical tools. We had anesthesia. Most of the time it was a nurse who gave the anesthesia. Sometimes I would give someone a spinal anesthetic. I would do the spinal anesthetic and then put my cap and mask and gloves and gown on and do the surgery. And someone else would come along occasionally and take a blood pressure.
Okay. What's a spinal anesthetic? A needle?
A needle into the spine.
Right into the spine?
Anesthetizes the lower half of the body.
At any time did you feel in danger?
Only when we were overrun.
Only when you were overrun.
I was sometimes overwhelmed by the responsibility I had with these wounded soldiers' lives.
Yeah, I bet. Did, how many people do you think you treated? Just too many to count?
How many did I?
Yeah, how many?
There must have been 600 or 700 procedures in the course of the year.
Wow.
Well, that year, and then I was transferred after a year. I went to Japan and was at the hospital where we sent these soldiers from the front lines. So then I would be treating the second level. But there were many hundreds of cases, so much so that the surgical boards gave me credit for a year's training.
Can you explain to me what a typical day waking up at the MASH would be like?
Well, if you had the night off, you'd get up, wash in hot water. That was an upturned helmet, metal helmet, sitting on top of the kerosene stove. You'd go to the mess tent and have breakfast, and there were people the cooks were there to provide food, and you'd get dressed, you'd be dressed and go into the hospital and make rounds on the ones that you'd operated on with the nurses, and then depending on what happened, whether you had new patients or whether you had to decide who was leaving and who wasn't, you'd have to get the paperwork in order, and you'd go for the day. Sometimes we'd be quiet, we'd go for a walk. You didn't want to go walking in the hills, because all those hills were mined. And there were many of our soldiers were wounded by mines because they went wandering up in the hills.
Korean enemy mines?
Yeah, these were enemy mines. There were signs all over, stay on the roads that have been cleared.
Yeah. You mentioned the food. How was the food?
Well, Army food, considering, was very good. It was hot, there was plenty of it. It was not gourmet, but at Thanksgiving they had turkey, and there was always something you could get hold of. The helicopter pilots could always get you anything you wanted from the markets in the cities, and they'd fly it back. So whiskey and liquor was freely available because they would be able to get it from the PXs.
Is that the most popular item?
No, beer was probably the most popular item.
Did you ever feel like you were ever short on supplies, that the Army didn't give you enough?
No, we had enough. The only time, one MASH I was assigned to, the one I mentioned where we were going to be transported by sea behind the enemy lines, there were no nurses except one. They were all corpsmen. And there we felt the need for trained nurses because the corpsmen just didn't have enough background to handle things that came up, how to empty tubes coming from the chest and an abdomen, things like that. But as far as supplies, no, we had plenty. And the other thing that we had always plenty of was blood. We used blood transfusions. That saved more lives than almost anything else. I have one hospital record that I kept where we gave the patient 22 pints of blood. That replaced their blood 4 and 5 times.
Wow.
But if we ran short of blood, the other soldiers would volunteer. Everybody knew their blood type, and we knew we needed X blood type. The call would go out, and 4 or 5 people would show up and donate blood.
How much blood did you take from them? How much blood did you take?
A pint.
Just a pint. Let's see. How did the blood travel by helicopter? Everything was dropped off by helicopter?
Well, no, some of it came by truck from lower down in Seoul.
Mm-hmm. Was it transferred from the mainland U.S.?
Well, the blood was shipped by air from the U.S., from Japan, and then either by helicopter or by truck to our hospital. Blood is usually good for about 30 days.
Did you ever keep in touch with your relatives while you were serving?
Well, it was difficult. I would go back down further south away from the front, and there would be a telephone office, and if I waited around for 3 or 4 hours, I might get a call through. But we didn't have email or cell phones, and what I did do at that time was write letters. I was a newlywed. Remember, I was 26 years old and a newlywed.
When did you get married? Before you went?
Before we went.
How long before?
A year.
Just a year? While you were at Yale? While you were in Yale?
Yes. And we wrote to each other every day, and we said we would write everything down so that when we met again we would not be strangers. And my wife collected my letters and her letters, and the university, and she edited them from 1,000,000 words to 100,000. And the University of Illinois published them in a book called We Will Not Be Strangers. It was the first book of letters between a soldier and the wife from the Korean War. There were books by soldiers, but rarely did the soldiers keep their letters from home. So this was our method of communication. I also took lots of pictures.
How regularly was your
interaction? It would sometimes come every day. Sometimes I wouldn't get them for a week. And we numbered the letters so that when I got a batch of 8 or 10 letters, I would read them in order.
How many were there altogether? You numbered
There were 600 letters.
Wow. Over 2 years?
Over the 1 year. Because in the second year, my wife came over to Japan and we lived in Japan. I worked at the hospital. She taught on the Army post and at the university.
Now you went to Japan after
Korea.
All those mashes, yeah. Was that still during the Korean War you were in Japan?
I was in Japan when the Korean War ended in '53, and I was in Japan at that time.
While you were serving, did you ever get R&R?
No, I went from Korea to Japan to a luxury hotel near Mount Fuji, and it was delightful.
Was that just for GIs, or
It was just for GIs. The Army had taken it over.
next to Mount
Beautiful
Fuji?
hotel, well, not next to, but within sight of. And they had hot mineral baths, all decorated in the basement. It was quite a change.
Man, what was that like? You were just loving it?
Oh, it was delightful. I had hot baths, massages, though I must admit I was talking to a Department of Army civilian couple who were working in Japan, and the woman said, oh, she had the wonderful masseuse yesterday. And I said, gee, I think I'm going to try it. She said, well, ask for, I don't remember the name. So I called down to the hotel desk, arranged for the masseuse, took my hot bath, went up to my room waiting for this lovely Japanese woman to give me a massage, and the knock on the door, and I opened the door, and so help me, it reminded me of a gorilla. There was a stocky Japanese man with arms, long arms. I had a wonderful massage, but it wasn't quite what I expected.
It was good?
It was good.
Did you go anywhere else over R&R?
No, I just had 6 days in Japan. I would wander the streets, go to some of the shops, but there wasn't that much in the area that I was. It was mainly the hotel.
How long was that for?
About 6 days.
6 days. You mentioned before you like to take pictures.
Oh, well, I have photography as a hobby, and I took several thousand Kodachrome slides and about 8 or 9 hours of movie film. And actually there's a company in Toronto that's making a documentary called The Real MASH, behind the show.
That's really cool.
And it's been done, but they used my pictures and movies for a lot of the background of the film. And they're now beginning to market it.
What's the real MASH? Explaining exactly what happened.
Well, they're using my pictures and interviews with surgeons and patients and helicopter pilots, interspersed with shots from the show, the MASH television show.
Yeah, the comedy.
Well, a comedy with a purpose. Remember, the MASH, people ask me, well, what's the difference between the show and the MASH? The TV show is entertainment, and while geographically it was very well done, most of it is made up to be entertaining. They did touch on some controversial issues.
Like what?
Well, the management of the regular army, the single-mindedness, it's definitely an anti-war, anti-army show. In fact, the author of the book from which this all developed felt that it was too frivolous. He was much more conservative than Hawkeye in the show.
And the real MASH is to serve a more commemorative purpose?
I don't follow you.
The show is for entertainment. What was the one they're making now, the real MASH?
Well, the documentary is to just show the difference between television and what really happened. It makes a point that war is not pleasant.
I totally agree. Okay, so after you left Korea and you went to Japan, you said your wife was teaching and you were helping out with the post-MASH?
Well, I was on the surgical staff. We would take care of the patients that were evacuated from Korea.
Where was this in Japan?
It was in the southern island of Kyushu, in the city of Fukuoka.
Were you stationed at a hospital?
It was a hospital, though we lived in a house that the army had taken over in the city among the Japanese.
And this is 1953?
1953.
What was that like, your work at the hospital?
Well, the hospital was a big modern hospital, and it was more like surgery in an American hospital. My wife taught GIs, taught English to GIs, many of whom had very little education. And she taught English to Japanese professors and some undergraduates at Kyushu University. Most of these professors were trying to get Fulbright scholarships. They could read and write English, but they couldn't speak very well. And so she had them as students, and of course they were very motivated. And she has a certificate which allows her to teach anything, anywhere in Japan for as long as she lives.
Wow.
But that's because when she got down to get the certificate, they asked her, "What do you want to teach?" She said, "Anything." They said, "Okay," because the head of the university had given her a letter telling them that she was going to be teaching. And I did some teaching in the medical school when I wasn't on call. And
now, you are still in the service at this time, you're not...
Oh yes, no, I didn't get out of the service until 1954, when I was back in the States.
Were you guys allowed to live with each other, you and your wife? Or did you still have to live in the barracks?
No. She would have come over to Korea, but she wasn't allowed to do that. But when she came, I could have stayed on the army post, or we lived among the Japanese. We wanted to live in the city to experience the Japanese culture. And it was a very good experience. In fact, two people we met, well, one person and her niece are coming to visit us next month. She is now in her 80s and has never been out of Japan, but we've been corresponding for years. And she sends us a Japanese fan every year. In fact, if you go around the other side here, you can get the fan and I'll show it to you. It's a blue fan right to your left. This is the fan that she just sent. And she sends one like it every year.
That's awesome. Do you correspond with anyone else?
Well, we met a young man on a train one weekend when we were free. This is in Japan. And he came over and started talking to us. He wanted to practice his English. He must have been in his teens. So we said, sure. And he would come after school, and my wife would work with him. And we were invited to his house. His father had been killed in World War II. His mother was a home economics professor at the university. And we have two of her books, of her home economics books in Japanese, which we have as showpieces, but we can't read them. We tried to study Japanese, but it was too much work. We could get by with conversation, but not with reading.
It's gotta be tough, yeah.
But he went on to become a transplant surgeon. He was trained by Dr. DeBakey in this country, and was a nephrologist back in Japan, and we've corresponded and visited with him, and he's been to visit us many times it's now almost 50 years.
Over 50 years. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
almost 60 years.
Yeah. Did you travel anywhere else other than Japan?
Well, from Korea, the only place I traveled was to Japan for that 1 week. when we got to Japan, I took time off and we traveled to Taiwan and Bangkok.
What was that like?
Well, we had friends in Taipei who met us at the airport, gave us a jeep tour of Taipei, and then we flew on to Bangkok.
Throughout your whole service, do you remember anything humorous that stuck out as funny?
Well, we laughed a lot, I'm sure, at our own foibles, but nothing comes to mind. Well, I guess we had some generals who were behaving obnoxiously, and we were working hard. We had a whole influx of wounded soldiers, and they were partying and getting a little drunk as they visited. And so some of us got together and mixed a drink for one of them and mixed a little urine in with it and gave it to him.
And he drank it?
And he drank it.
Did you tell him afterwards?
No.
Does he know to this day?
No.
That's awesome. Did you have any entertainment while you were in service?
Yeah, the USO would send groups through, either a couple of men and a couple of women, and there would either be a comedian or a singer or dancer or a combo.
Now, I saw from your photographs you had a picture of William Holden.
Yeah, and actors and actresses came through. Holden came through and visited. And then when I was in Japan, Marilyn Monroe came through with Joe DiMaggio. Now, one of my friends had been I'm blocking at his name now. He had been a Yankee baseball player, and he was over there with me, and he traveled with Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio as sort of a liaison.
He was a Yankee baseball player that played with Joe DiMaggio?
Yeah.
You can't remember his name?
Bobby... It's just on the tip of my tongue. Well, I'll think about it.
You'll remember it now.
But I think he was a third baseman, and he hit either the winning run or a home run in one of the World Series. But he was a surgeon.
That's real cool.
He was a very nice guy, and he was not a surgeon. He was an internist, and he everywhere he went, they said his first name was Bobby. Bobby, not Bobby Clark, but something. They would say, you play baseball for us here at the post, and we'll keep you here. And then when the time came, they say, well, Bob, you know, you're such a newsworthy, we can't really keep you. You'll have to move on. So he finally said, I'm not going to play any more baseball. I want to go up to the front lines, get my points, because for each month you served, you got points.
Oh, he was a soldier.
What?
Bobby was a soldier?
No, he was a doctor.
Oh.
But where you were, the closer to the front, the more points you got per month.
What do you mean points?
You would, if you were up at the front and you were, when you stayed a month, you would get, say, 3 points. Further back, 2 points. Where I was, you'd get 1 point. And when you got 12 or 15 points, you could be shipped out.
That's why it took you over a year?
It took me a year. But, so he went up to the front.
Now, is the match different, closer to the front line? It's not a match?
No, the match was close to the front lines, but it wasn't at the front line.
Say if you wanted to earn 3 points?
You'd be right up at the front line in a battalion aid station.
Wow. That's, you're probably shooting.
Well, the soldier would be brought in 100 yards from you.
Yeah.
Sometimes a quarter of a mile. We would take, helicopters sometimes would take us up to the aid station. There'd be a smoke flare down below. We'd land, pick up the patient, and bring him back.
Were you ever on one of those?
Yes, I had movies of those. In fact, I was flying along and I saw these puffs of smoke below us. I was in a helicopter. I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, those are mortar shells that they're shooting up at you." I took my parachute off and sat on it.
You said you have 800 hours of movie footage?
Yeah.
You were carrying a camera in your spare time?
Whenever I could, I took pictures.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And the company that made the documentary digitized them and used clips. They didn't use all of them, obviously, but there are many times I saw my pictures on the screen.
Was there sound in your movies? Is there sound, or is it just visual?
They're just visual. Remember, this was back in 1952. You didn't have cameras
Maybe your photos
like this.
Are perfect.
Just film.
Yeah. The photos I've seen of yours are perfect. I don't understand how a camera could have been so good back then. Perfect. Did you keep a personal diary while you were in the service?
No, the
letters.
The letters was like a personal diary.
And do you recall the day your service ended, your last day?
Oh yes, I was home. I was on terminal leave, and I was supposed to return 2 or 3 weeks later to be discharged, given my discharge papers and pay. And I remember they called my house, and my mother answered, and they said, "Am I here?" Were asking if I was around. They wanted me to be discharged early. And I said, "No, I can't come because I wanted to have a full 2 years of service, because people had been redrafted because they had less than 2 years of service." So I went back, and after my 2 years were up, and I was then discharged.
What did you do after the service?
Well, I had to complete my surgical training, so I was a American Cancer Society surgical fellow at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York for 2 years.
So you got your BA in Columbia, your master's at Harvard. You went
No, MD at Harvard.
MD, I'm sorry, MD at Harvard. Then you went to Yale, and then you went back to Columbia after your service?
Yeah, to finish my surgical training so I would be a certified board surgeon, B-O-A-R-D, not B-O-R. Yeah, I look very good on paper.
Ah, I bet. Wow. Did you ever join a veterans organization after?
No, I do support the Korean War Veterans Association here in Connecticut, and I've occasionally given programs or attended some of their meetings.
And when you went back to Columbia to finish your schooling, did the government help you pay for that?
No.
It was all on your own? And did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, there are some... War is an abhorrent thing. There should be other ways of solving problems than killing hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people. So when a group of soldiers can shoot into a mass of unarmed people, something's wrong. And if you have a rifle and have to kill somebody, most people have to dehumanize the opponent. So we used to call the Germans Krauts, the Japanese soldiers, the Yellow Peril, the Chinks, the Gooks. We found names for them. And they were no longer human, so you could shoot and kill them. So absolutely against war. You may have to fight if you're attacked. Now, what else did you say as to the Army? Well, the Army has a mentality that's sometimes too fixed. There too much emphasis is placed on routine and rigmarole. It may be that that's necessary so that when a soldier is faced with a situation and the commander says, do this, he won't second think it. But there have been studies that show other countries, some other countries, that allow the enlisted lower ranked personnel to offer suggestions as to what to do in a wartime situation, that you end up with a better solution than just relying on the general.
The military probably doesn't like that.
No, military, you know, you serve, your superior has absolute power over you.
How did your service and experience affect your life?
Well, first of all, it made me realize the value of the family and how important it is to keep loving relationships alive, and that pertains work. Professionally, it helped me immensely because I felt I could handle almost anything that came around. There's a story that I now agree with completely. The Frank Leahy, the head of the Leahy Clinic, the man who founded it, was once asked by a resident, Dr. Leahy, how come you don't perspire like many other surgeons do when you're in the operating room? And he said, well, I used to perspire a lot. Then I learned my anatomy.
Did you perspire?
I perspired.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, no, not really. Just to say that I think I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my life because of the experiences, the places I was trained, my family. Oh, I didn't tell you that after I came back and practiced surgery here in Manchester for 30 years, I then went to law school. I went back to Yale and got a law degree and became a health policy consultant. And if I ever get around to it and live long enough, my last book will be Nobody Listened, So I'm Going Fishing.
Wow. Wow. You have a lot of education. Well, thank you.
Thank you.